Hello, my name is Kevin, and today in this video I'm going to walk through Kohi.shop and talk a little bit about how this website here is created, the tools that are used, why I use them, and so forth. So before I get started, a couple high-level points, I guess. First, the website here is live as of this recording. It's a real website. It's for myself. I roast and sell coffee beans. Though, to be honest, depending on when you watch this video, it's possible I've gotten fed up with roasting and selling coffee beans. So the website itself may no longer be here, but at least for now, it's a real thing. But in reality, the website, although it's made to sell coffee beans, was actually really created more as a learning exercise for myself to learn a bit about the technologies that I use to make the website. And those technologies, and kind of the point of this video, are one, Angular, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, and two, Magento 2. So essentially what we're looking at here is an Angular 2 / Angular 4 / these days I believe it's just Angular front end with a completely headless implementation of Magento 2 on the back end. A couple more high-level things, I guess. The website itself, although it's fairly snappy, I like to think, so that was just a refresh, and things come back pretty quickly. It's actually running on a $5 a month DigitalOcean droplet, so no major server or anything like that. And although, of course, the refresh here, there's not all that much content on the web page. Things like add to cart, which you can kind of see this loading icon, are pretty quick. By no means do I think that this website would scale to any sort of medium-sized company or anything like that, or at least not certainly a large company. But the point is, just the same, it's totally usable for something small like this. And again, it's a $5 a month DigitalOcean droplet, so it's pretty cheap, which I think is kind of interesting to point out, just because oftentimes Magento, and in particular Magento 2, get a bad rap for being sort of big, slow machines. But the reality is, if you're doing something like this that's completely headless and you don't have to worry about the front end at all, it's actually reasonably fast, and it's pretty easy to do a lot of pretty simple optimizations that make things even faster. So we'll talk more about that in a second. The real story here, I guess, for me at least, is the Angular piece of this. So this, again, is an Angular implementation. If we open up and view the actual source of the page, you can see not a whole lot here. This is just Angular. This is basically the output of the ng CLI. So for anybody familiar with Angular, it's basically the tool that you use for doing development, and also you can use it for building sort of like your production assets, and that's what we see here. So it does minification and uglification and all that kind of thing, and it adds these nice hashes to all of our static resources so that we can cache them indefinitely, which makes it easier to get page speed insights. It makes it easier to get high numbers on this type of tool. Not that Kohi.shop. Not that this is necessarily the be-all, end-all of performance test. Lighthouse and stuff like that are probably better indications. But the point is, still a 99 out of 100, even for a super simple single-page app, it's pretty good. Again, it's way more difficult to get a high rating like this on more of a traditional website. So again, I realize this isn't some amazing feat or something, but just the same. Again, the CLI here makes it easy to do this. The only thing actually rendered on the page, other than the sort of the static resources, are the meta tags required to support sort of a nice social sharing representation. So when you paste a link to Kohi.shop on Facebook or whatever, the meta tags are just to make sure that it shows up and looks nice. And then, of course, Google Analytics, which is actually a bit of an eyesore thorn in my side kind of thing, because I don't know if you noticed, I guess I can open it back up, but Google page speeds, the one thing keeping us from 100% is in fact Google Analytics itself, and the headers that are passed back from Google. So this is something that I think I can solve, but I haven't really felt like it. This is totally a nights and weekend kind of thing. Again, it's my own website, so I'm certainly not getting paid for any of this work. Yeah, it was just kind of fun for me. So that's kind of the systems at play here. I don't know if I mentioned this is Magento 2.1.7, I think, that I'm running on. The specific version doesn't matter all that much. This is the open source, aka free version of Magento 2, which for me at least is perfectly adequate for, I think, actually most people. And yeah, certainly for me, where I'm really not making any money selling coffee, it's all that I wanted to purchase, which is nothing. So on the Angular side of things, how is this actually all working? So as I mentioned, it's headless, and as we sort of looked at the source, you can see there's no Magento stuff being rendered at all. The basic strategy here that I took is I wanted to reduce the number of HTTP requests as much as possible. I wanted to do a little bit of caching on the Magento side of things without introducing a whole huge layer of complexity with something like Varnish, or having to worry about Fastly or paying for Fastly and SSL termination. I actually used Let's Encrypt, which is amazing, free tool for getting a totally valid SSL certificate. So again, free. Yeah, but the point is I wanted to keep things relatively simple. So if we actually look at the request here, we'll see there's not a whole lot happening. So I'll go ahead and refresh this page. And we can see when the page loads, in terms of XHR, basically AJAX requests, if you will, there's only 3. One is to get the state of the cart, which I store in local storage. Actually, take a look, I guess. I should also point out, by the way, a couple of things. One, by no means is this any sort of authoritative, authoritative video about how you should be doing this. There's certainly considerations. For example, is it okay to store the card ID here in session storage? Are there security implementations, or I'm sorry, are there security ramifications of doing this versus session storage? This is sort of like a demo, you can think of it, that I actually sell coffee, but yeah. So take everything here with a grain of salt. It's just sort of one way that you could do this. And again, I'm just kind of sharing this in case it's interesting for somebody. So I store the cart ID here inside of local storage. When the page loads, I check. I don't, of course, make a call to check the contents of a cart if I don't have a cart ID. So in this situation, I have items in my cart, and I have a cart ID, so therefore I go and fetch the cart. I fetched this coffee. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but this is basically just a really lightweight wrapper around the out-of-the-box Magento 2 products API. So the only reason I did this is basically to first pare down the information that comes back, sort of to give me just a minimal set of information that I want. Quantity may or may not be something you're comfortable exposing. For me, totally fine. But you'll see I added this coffee information snippet. So this is the information. If we scroll down and click expand details, it's the information about this specific batch. So this is the second batch of coffee I'm roasting. And I built a really simple system in Magento 2 just for managing coffee roasting batches. So again, that's kind of the point of me doing this, just to give me a little more fine-grained control of what data I'm pulling back. And then the other thing I grab is also a custom API endpoint. This I don't believe Magento gives you out of the box, but it's very simple to expose this. This is basically just, I call it content. But what it really is, it's Magento 2 has this concept of content blocks. So these are blocks that are basically fragments of content, HTML and so forth, that are intended to be rendered on the front end in sort of more of a traditional way within the Magento interface. But what I do is I basically expose these through this REST API and just display them directly on the page. But I let the Angular application control where they're displayed. So what this lets me do is, for example, this little snippet on the top, I think this is called short about or something like that. Yeah, so this is like the actual content. It allows me to edit all of the content within Magento, but have it all, of course, rendered on the front end here by Angular. So I think this is not a particularly clever or particularly inventive use of content blocks. I'm essentially using them as I think was intended by Magento, except that I'm doing it through this custom API endpoint. But the point is, there's actually only a couple of calls made when the page loads. If we do something like, for example, add a product to the cart, you'll see that api.kohi.shop is the actual endpoint. Now, spoiler alert, if you were to go there right now, you would actually see a sort of broken Magento front end. Generally, this should be hidden, / there should be some sort of Apache rewrite setup so you can actually, or NGRX or whatever, but some sort of setup so that you can't get here. But at this point, again, this isn't really it's production, and that it's production, but not production as in I'm going to be, losing too much sleep if somebody were to go here and wanted to try to check out. You probably can. But anyway, that's basically all this is, and you'll see, I guess my original point there was just that there's two requests here. There's an options request when I'm doing something like posting, and of course the actual post. So again, nothing too crazy there, just kind of what you would expect. If I delete a product, you'll get the same behavior. So here we're deleting a product in the cart. So we get our options request, and then of course we get our delete. So that is kind of a breakdown, roughly, of how the site works. I won't go through the checkout process here, but this is just a simple Angular form. Nothing too crazy here. Let's see. Grand Rapids, Michigan. Actually, I'm currently in Chicago, Illinois. Zip code 60647. The only other thing, and the reason I'm bothering even going through here, this payment bit is, if you actually look in the request, this is actually all handled by Braintree. So I actually do something very similar to what we have sort of an out-of-the-box Magento. The only difference is that, of course, I'm doing it with an Angular, but the idea is basically the same, which is I'm using Braintree.js to generate securely, without collecting any PII or any sort of credit card information that would actually be something I wouldn't want to know. But I, again, use Braintree.js to collect that credit card information, send it to Braintree, and then Braintree just passes me back securely a nonce that I have also exposed a custom endpoint in Magento to consume. I think that's a custom endpoint. But regardless, essentially the same exact thing happens here as it does when you're using the front end of Magento. So although I am I'm collecting credit card information, I'm not doing anything really all that different from what Magento is doing if I were to use the sort of native out-of-the-box Magento implementation. Yeah, so that's how I handle credit cards. Everything else works out of the box with Magento, so products and the way that credit card configurations are actually set up in the back of Magento, all that kind of stuff. Same thing as Magento out of the box. So the reality is, and this is something that was part of my goal, the website, despite the front end being Angular, is fairly vanilla on the back end of Magento. Just briefly, there's 3 modules that I have created for customizing Magento, and these are the only 3 modules that are actually installed. So checkout, like I mentioned, exposes some endpoints for doing things like tokenization of credit cards, and yeah, so this bit here, the payment stuff. Kohi, sort of a poor name, but basically this is just that lightweight product wrapper that gives me back sort of a very specific set of product attributes that I'm interested in. And this simple API cache, it's sort of a bunch of different modules, or at least concepts of modules that I kind of jam together in a really simple, very simple way. But essentially, all this is, or all this does, is it listens. In fact, I can briefly show you. There's a plugin here, the app interface plugin, and really all this is doing is at the earliest point in the Magento application that you can sort of break into without doing anything major. This sort of sits there, it waits for a request to come in. Very simple check pattern matching to see if the particular request can be cached or could be served from cache. And if so, then it will just basically pull a version of the request out of cache and return it directly, as opposed to going through the normal entire application. So what that really looks like is, for me, and for this particular example, the Kohi request, so basically the product information is cached, that GET request, and then the content call is cached. And those are the only 2 calls that are actually cached in this entire thing. My thinking there, again, maybe I shave off a half a second or something like that on page load. And of course, anybody visiting this website, regardless if you actually transact or add a product to the cart, is going to have to load the product information. So I figured those would be 2 things that would be worthwhile caching. So that's kind of the only customizations on the back end of Magento. One other piece about checkout that actually I didn't mention. I personally, although you might call it REST-ish, probably not following all the principles of REST, but when I add or delete a product from the cart or create a new cart, I always return the entire state of the cart. So out of the box with Magento, I actually don't remember off the top of my head, but some types of actions, for example, again, just an example, I actually don't think this may be the case, but if you were to add a new product to the cart, you might get like a 201 back, which I think is the created status, but you may not actually get a payload back. So basically, and that may be the correct way to do it, but for me, with this front-end implementation approach, it's sort of convenient to always get back the full state of the cart. So that's another sort of modification I made here in this checkout module. So those are kind of the big pieces. This is roughly how this works. The images actually are one thing that I guess I could mention. I don't actually host these images in Magento. They're not managed in Magento. That is because I thought it might be nice to have the images just hosted in S3. Of course, there's all sorts of solutions to this. I could have made a module to manage your images in S3 from Magento, but sort of knowing what my end goal was going to be in terms of the scope of this website, I actually just have a very simple convention, which is this image is a certain bucket in S3 followed by the product SKU. So yeah, very simple. Angular spits out this base path, which is just configured in the Angular app. And then again, I just basically append the SKU of the particular product that I'm looking at. And that's it. So it makes it easy for me to switch images out in S3. And I can use the S3 tools for setting all the caching headers specifically like I want in a GUI. Again, would this be easy to maintain for a company with 100,000 products or 1 million products? Absolutely not. Probably would not be the best way to do that. But I do think it's a totally valid way for a website like this it's a decision, and it's totally fine for me. So I think it's fine. The only other thing I guess that I mentioned briefly is that, and I actually have a local development copy of this running here. Again, this is just using the Angular CLI, which is great, by the way. But one interesting thing, and actually really the primary goal for me for this entire project, was to learn a little bit more about Redux, basically, which is, if you're familiar with React, is a tool or a library or maybe a methodology almost of managing the state of your React application. For me, I'm interested in Angular at this point, not for any great reason, but it's just kind of where I'm dedicating my spare nights and weekends kind of thing. So within the Angular world, there's a library or a tool called NGRX, and NGRX is again very similar to Redux, and in fact, although I have to warn you, it's quite buggy, so it's a little crushing. This may crash. There may be some weird bug that happens. I may have to restart Chrome, so you've been warned. It may happen. Apologies if it does. But there's this great tool which was actually made for Redux called Redux Dev Tools. And this kind of gives you an idea of what's happening in the application and sort of, I think it's kind of cool. So I'll try at least to demo this. Okay, so basically, as I mentioned, this tool that I'm using, NGRX, is for managing the state of your application. So that means you can high level, and I should say I'm not an expert. Again, this was a learning experience for me. But high level, you can sort of see it like a database of not just the data that your application may need to store, but also the state of various, of really everything. So what route am I at, or how does my user interface look like? It's all controlled within this one sort of piece of state, and there's sort of only one way to put state changes in and to take state changes out. And because of that, what that means is that we can do things like we can do time travel, where we can actually go back in time to where our application first bootstrapped, and we can actually play through the state of the application, because again, there's only sort of one place that state change happens, so we can easily watch it and see what happens. So for example, the catalog we can see is at this point loading, and that has caused this loading icon to come up. Now we're loading the content. Now we've navigated to a particular route. Now we've set the content, and now we've set the catalog, so we can see, sure enough, that catalog loaded at this point. So we can go back and forward, set catalog. We set the cart items because we went and fetched that, and so you can see now that caused the interface to stop the loading animation. We set our shipping address, set totals. Here is where I open the cart overlay. So again, even stuff like this is all sort of maintained in this one state. So again, we can easily play through this, and there you go. Now we close the cart. So this uses observables, so any piece of your application or a component, which you can sort of think is a piece of functionality within Angular. You can use observables, and when a piece of state changes, you basically get a notification. You can think of it sort of like a, hey, something changed, this state that you're interested in, there is an update. And then the component, Angular handles most of this for you, but the component then will redraw itself as appropriate. So again, I didn't specifically have to say when there is a change here, then do this, and then check this. I just say, if the display cart overlay is true, then show this modal. And then again, Angular and NGRX take care of the rest of it. But this has been, for me, a spectacular way to develop an application like this. Because if we look at the state, this is so basically the entire state of the application. I have one place where things like product information live, which means it's really easy. I don't have to sort of wonder when I switch from one page to the next. For example, when I go to the FAQ page, I don't have to try to dig through the DOM or even dig through some custom component or something like that to check to see if the FAQ is loaded. There's one single place, which is the content area. I can open it here. Well, good news. I think this may have crashed, but we made it through most of it. Within this content area, the FAQ, for example, is, and there's always one place I check for state, and if for some reason, there it is. We'll just click wait for now. If for some reason the FAQ hadn't been loaded yet, then there's one place that I go to ask the FAQ to load, and that makes it again really easy to kind of always have an accurate picture of your state. You're not making duplicate calls because you're not sure if you have something loaded or not. Everything is in one spot. So that's been for me at least great. I'm sure as I learn more, we'll continue to wait. As I learn more about Redux and NGRX, I'd like to sort of integrate it more into projects I work on. And in general, observables, something that I think pretty awesome. And again, they're not just a JavaScript thing. They're useful in all sorts of different types of applications, and there's libraries in all sorts of languages. So again, that's been a great thing I've learned and been able to get quite a bit out of. So with that said, I guess we'll just go ahead and kill Redux Tools. And I'll pretty much end that here, I guess. Thank you for watching, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be super curious to know comments or suggestions, anything like that. Thank you.